Welcome to Getting Started with Amplified Texas Habilidades y Destrezas webinar. We're so excited to have you join us today introducing the Amplified Texas Habilidades y Destrezas curriculum. Who am I? My name is Ana Torres. I am an Amplify facilitator. Don't like to call myself a presenter. So I'll be facilitating the information that I will be giving to you about the Habilidades y Destrezas program. I've been in education for approximately 25 years. I've worked in various parts of the country, Dallas, Texas. I've also worked in Austin, Texas, and I'm now currently based out of New Orleans, Louisiana, which is where I was raised. I'm originally from Panama City, Panama. And also, just so you know, I've served in many various roles in my 25 years in education. I've been a bilingual teacher of all subjects. I've also been a dual language instructional coach, a mentor, master teacher, and I've also been an assistant principal here in New Orleans in a Spanish immersion program here at a charter school. So I've got varied experiences, and I'm super excited to be here with you, giving you this information. One question that I want you to be thinking of before we begin: if you are currently using Amplify Texas Lectoescritura, what are some components of the program that you like? And also, which ones do you think support emerging bilingual students the most? Let's look at our agenda together, because we're going to dive into this session. But let's take a sneak peek here at what our session will look like and what our time together is going to look like. So that was your welcome. Excited to have you. You know a little bit about me. We'll be then segueing into the program design. Then we'll be talking about habilidades y destrezas, what materials you will have. Looking at a unit introduction, looking at lesson components and segments. And also, I know what you want to know, though, how do we order this, the print and order logistics. And then finally, we're going to do some reflection and then close out. So that's what our time together will look like. So some learning norms. This is a webinar. Want to make sure you participate actively. And what that means is if you need a piece of paper, you want to jot down some ideas as we go through the webinar, feel free to do that. Taking care of yourself means if you need to, for whatever reason, pause this webinar and come back to it, feel free to do that. Staying engaged pretty much means just listening to the information, jotting down any ideas that you have as we go through. What is learned here obviously leaves here. We want you to take the information that you're learning and take it back to your schools and to your classrooms. And finally, I want to make sure that you know that I will be facilitating this session in English, but there will be throughout the presentation some translations that I'll be doing in Spanish as well. So just our learning norms before we begin. What is this program? So TEA wants you to know, new program for the 2022-2023 school year. So Habilidades y Destrezas is a Tier 1 K-2 Spanish foundational literacy curriculum, which was developed by Amplify and Texas Education Agency, also known as TEA. Let me tell you what it is. It is an open education resource that is available in perpetuity for Texans. Also, it's freely available in a digital form on the Amplify Teacher Resources website. In addition to that, this curriculum has been built from the ground up in Spanish by bilingual educators for bilingual educators and students in Texas. Also, it is designed to align to the Spanish language arts TEKS. And finally, it completes the suite of Amplify Texas Lectoescritura en Español materials for grades K-2, which complements the K-2 knowledge building domains that Amplify Texas has rolled out as well, which is called Conocimientos. Want you to know that units 1 and 2 of grades kinder, first, and second are posted on the teacher resources site. Those who have accounts will be able to have access to those materials. I'm also going to actually show you where those materials are a little bit later on in the session. I'm going to go to that teacher resources site and show you where these materials are digitally. So using the session resources, what we'll be able, hopefully what participants, which are you, will be able to do, describe the Amplified Texas Habilidades y Destrezas, which is also known in English as the skill strand, identifying and describing those program design principles is our first objective. Our second objective, examining, having a chance to look at those materials for Amplified Texas Habilidades and Destrezas on the teacher resource site. So those of you who have access can go on the site, but I will also go live for those of you who do not. And so we'll be able to look at those resources and those materials that are there. And thirdly, we hope that at the end of this session, you'll be able to identify some key aspects of an Amplified Texas Habilidades y Destrezas unit and lesson. So those are our 3 objectives for this session. Most importantly, we want to make sure that we are preparing you with an overview of the program. So our main focus is on helping you develop understanding of that skill strand. So the first part of our session, as I mentioned in our agenda, it's going to be devoted to understanding the program design of Habilidades y Destrezas, also known as the skill strand. But before we dive in, I want to ask a question. Kind of want to do like a quick little check. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar are you with the research on how the brain learns to read? On a scale of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where do you fit? How familiar are you with the research on how the brain learns to read? So reading is a combination of the ability to decode, actually sound out and read words on a page, and comprehend or understand what those words mean. So we're looking at reading, reading proficiency equals decoding and word recognition times language comprehension. And so that what we'll be looking at specifically in this session is the decoding and word recognition, also known as the skill strand, Habilidades y Destrezas curriculum. We'll be looking at the recognition strand. So based on reading research, the Amplify skill strand, Habilidades y Destrezas, has 2 main principles, 2 main design principles that we want to explore and look at. The first one, sounds first approach, but know that that sounds first approach starts with the vowels. A, E, I, O, U. Also looking at, as we are starting with those sounds and starting with those vowels, we'll be explicitly and systematically looking at that syllable instruction. One thing that we want to make sure to note is that the curriculum is authentic to Spanish and supports biliteracy. So let's think about Amplified Texas Lectoescritura en Español. And we want to make sure that we understand that it's built on, that everything is built on the simple view of reading, built on the science of teaching reading. So leaders in education recognize that there is significant impact that reading experience can have when it is based on combining systematic and explicit skills with a deep wealth of knowledge. So what we're looking at here is that in Amplify Texas, the Amplify Texas Conocimiento piece, which is language comprehension, is a main component, but there's also another component that's just as important, which is our habilidades and destrezas strand, which is word recognition. Both of these combined obviously produce the skilled reading and comprehensively give you the amplified text as escritura en español. But today, in this webinar, we want to make sure that we're focusing on this other critical component in the amplified texts, habilidades y destrezas, the act of word recognition, the act of decoding. Before we move into that, let's look at the science of teaching reading in dual language. So based on research, developing that reading proficiency in both English and Spanish follows very similar framework and or structure. So in both languages, instruction was focused on developing both language comprehension and word recognition. In amplified texts, there are some differences in the approach to word recognition simply based on the orthographic transparency of each language. Let's take a look at this chart. So in English, which is one of the most opaque alphabetic languages with 44 phonemes, which are represented orthographically by approximately 150 graphemes, which in essence, 44 sounds, 150 sound spellings. But let's, in contrast, look at Spanish, which is one of the most transparent languages, with between 20 to 24 phonemes and almost one-to-one match to graphemes. So because both English and Spanish are alphabetic languages, calling students' attention to individual Spanish phonemes first and syllables later serve a dual function as they learn to read in both languages. So as we look at Spanish, again, transparent language, approximately 24 sounds, nearly one-to-one match to sound spelling. We also want to take a look at that development of foundational skills in Spanish. What does that include? Systematic scope and sequence, phonological awareness, dictation, which is also known as dictado. I'm going to go over that a little bit later in the session. Decoding connected text, grammar, and all of it is based on the TEKS. Let's look at an example of this. So how are things systematically and explicitly taught in this curriculum? Let's take a look at this example. As mentioned before, we start with the sound, empezar con el sonido. And making an important note that starting with the sound, starting with those vowels first. So in this example, we have the vowel O. So starting with the sound, empezando con el sonido, vowels first. Then we're building those syllables, construyendo sílabas. In this example, we have o, so. As we are explicitly and systematically teaching, we're now moving on to forming those words, formar palabras. In this case, we started with the sound, with the vowel sound of O, building that with syllable o, so, forming that word oso. And then we're cracking that code in text, right? Descifrando el código. So as we're looking at this example, this is a kinder example that I didn't mention initially, looking at text that students will be looking at in kinder, we see that the word oso is in this text. So they're going to be able to crack that code as they're systematically and explicitly taught in this way. But let's look also as we continue looking at other examples. So we're going to look at comparing these examples of text and vocabulary from kindergarten and second grade. So explicit instruction in Spanish foundational literacy supports students in decoding and comprehending more complex words. Like for in this example, from oso, the kinder example, to murciélago, right? For second grade. So, and then also looking at not only for vocabulary, but let's look at text. In this kinder text, we're looking at Mimi pasa, just looking at that first sentence there. And then as we progress to second grade, we're looking at, pero podemos hacer una videollamada that we see here. So what's happening here is that student in this curriculum, they'll also be it also grows in complexity. Aumenta la complejidad. So lessons continue to challenge students as they progress, introducing more complexity. For example, multisyllabic words. So what do we have here? Continuing with our discussion of explicit and systematic instruction. So we have instruction, which is explicit and systematic as we introduce those sounds, vowels first, and then continuing with syllables. And moving on to spelling of that sound afterward, which supports in that reciprocal process of reading text and spelling and writing. And then that repeated practice helps to increase that automaticity and fluency, which in essence allows students to then practice in texts that are decodable. And to practice that sound spelling correspondence learned in that connected text. As we continue to discuss and talk about the program design of Habilidades and Destrezas, we also want to add that there is grammar that is also included here, gramática. Here's an example of a grammar lesson where students are exposed to and asked to identify plural nouns. This teacher will, in essence, project this digital image. And as the teacher, as the students hear the teacher read the sentence there, they will be identifying what those plural nouns are. So that's an example of a grammar lesson. Another example that we also wanted to introduce to you is an example of a writing lesson. And so here's an example of a first grade lesson where students are going to be preparing to write their first narrative, and they'll be using a graphic organizer to help them do that. Lastly, wanted to show you an example of a dictado, of a dictation. And this is an example of a second grade dictado. Teacher will dictate, read aloud words. Students, words, for example, such as burbuja, verano, vaso, bonito. Students will write the spelling of the words, and then teachers will write the correct spelling of those words on the board and have those students self-correct, and or she can correct, or he or she can correct those. So that's an example of dictado, a second grade dictado session. So we wanted to make sure that we introduce the examples of a grammar lesson, a writing lesson, and also a dictation, a dictado lesson as well. So now that we've gone through the program design session part of our time together, let's take a look at and be pondering on this question. And obviously, if you're taking notes and if you're jotting down things, feel free to continue to do that. So based on the design principles, how will Amplified Texas address your students' literacy needs? So now giving you some additional information as it relates to the program design and various things that you'll have. In grades K to 2, students will receive 40 minutes of daily instructions in the skills strand, Habilidades and Destrezas. What you will also get, you'll receive a set of teacher guides to use for skills instruction throughout the year. They're going to be 9 units per year with 20 lessons in each, and the breakdown of that is 18 regular lessons, 2 pausing points. I'm going to talk about pausing points a little bit later on in the session, and there'll be varied assessments throughout the unit. As it relates to assessments, so assessments are another important component of the Amplified Texas curriculum. So there'll be three different types of assessments. You'll have your long cycle assessments, which Amplified Texas has BOY, MOY, and EOY. And I mean, we all love our acronyms, right? Beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year assessments. You'll also have medium cycle assessments, which are your end of unit assessments, both for skills and knowledge. You'll have both of those. And you'll also have short cycle assessments, which are formative assessments and checks for understanding throughout your lessons. So that culminates our program design part of the webinar. And so now what we're going to do, what we want to do is give you a better understanding of the why behind the skills standard approach. And so let's take a sneak peek at the skills like unit 1 teacher guide. Let's take a sneak peek. So this is meant to give you just a brief overview of your teacher guide, which is going to focus on the unit introduction and the lesson components. So now we're going to look a little deeper at one of the Amplified Texas materials. So let's start off kind of like with a little game, if you will. What do these three objects have in common? What do we have here? We have car, we have a camera, we also have a washing machine. Let me give you a hint. Think of something that all of these objects come with that helps you know how to use them. You got it. All of these objects come with manuals that no one reads, even though I have read my manual for my car. As it's getting older, I need to make sure I know how to fix things on my own instead of bringing them to the shop and spending money. So yeah, all of these objects come with a manual that no one reads. So I remember doing this as a teacher, super. It can be uncommon. I wanted to dive in my lesson and get going and get ready. Because our schedules are so busy, we want to just jump right into those lessons and plan, and we want to skip the unit and lesson introductions. However, there's so much valuable information in this what we want to call this our owner's manual, that when we know it well, we can take our lessons from good to great. And I know everybody wants to take those lessons from good to great. So let's look and review our manual before we even get started. Let's look at your teacher's guide. So what is included in your teacher's guide? So we're going to do a quick overview of those sections. And we want to start off with that first section in that teacher's guide, which is your contents. Your table of contents gives you an overview of what's included and what lessons are included. So it's more than just page numbers. It's an overview of the content of that unit. And in addition, the content provides quick but informative summary of those lesson components, the various activities in those lessons, and even gives you that time allocation, which is included in each lesson and the unit as a whole. So the contents section is super, super important and vital, gives you lots of really great information. So included in that content page are the lesson components and the segments. What are those, right? So the lesson components refer to the large section of the lesson. So for example, this lesson has two lesson components: foundational skills, which are known as Destrezas fundamentales, and also you have lectura, which is your reading section here. So those are known as your lesson components, which are your larger sections of the components. So foundational skills and reading in this particular example. But also included here are your lesson segments. What are those? Those refer to the smallest sections within each lesson component. So for example, if we look at the reading component, look at these segments in this section, we see it has three specific lesson segments. And in those lesson segments, you will have presentar el capítulo, which just means to present the actual chapter; leer en el mercado, which is read the actual article in el mercado; And then what you'll also have is práctica de leer frases, which is practice reading phrases. So in the lesson component of lectura, these will be your 3 lesson segments. And in the foundational skills here, calentar motores, which is your warm-up, repaso de ortografía, which is just review of spelling. So that's how you would look at that and read that and synthesize that information. So after your content, your table of contents section, you will move on. What follows that is the unit introduction. One thing that's important to note in your unit introduction is that each unit introduction will have some elements that are different. Specifically, if we look at Unit 1. Unlike other units, Unit 1 teacher guide has 2 introductions. One, the Amplified Texas program introduction itself, and then an introduction of the unit. So it'll have 2 different sections here. So Unit 1 is unique. Knowing that the Amplified Texas program introduction gives you a total overview of the skill strand, and it includes descriptions of the strand materials and components, and it also highlights key unit and lesson features. And in addition, that introduction for the unit is super valuable. You will find, like just even looking at this really nice example here, a summary of those specific skills that will be covered in the unit. So reading that unit introduction in each teacher guide is very, very important as you prepare for that unit, which we'll cover in more detail a little bit later. Now we're going to segue into our section of the lesson overview. So there you're going to find, as you move through your lessons, this is an example of a lesson, you're going to find the primary focus of the lesson, which states the main purpose of each activity and the standard it covers. You're also going to be looking at how to prepare, what background knowledge students need to have. And look, evaluación formativa. So then we're looking at formative assessments. That's also embedded here. So this is used to track whether students are mastering the primary focus objectives. So over the course of the entire unit, the primary focus objectives are formatively assessed on multiple occasions so that teachers have a clear sense of individual student progress before the end of the unit. What you'll also see embedded is what's called vistazo a la lección, which is your lesson at a glance. And this lesson at a glance outlines the activities for each lesson. As you look at these arrows, it also even, again, gives you what the specific components of that particular lesson will be. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the vistazo a la lección, that lesson at a glance, which is a super neat resource to have right at your fingertips. So remember, and just a quick reminder, the lesson component refers to the larger section of the lesson. And for example, here, this lesson has 2 lesson components: foundational skills, destrezas fundamentales, y también ortografía, which is spelling. And then as you look at this specific section here in this lesson at a glance, the lesson segments, of course, refer to the smaller sections within each lesson. And so, for example, here, as we're looking at this specific section here, the foundational skills, juego con sílabas, which is a game, syllable game, and then leer y completar palabras, right? Reading words, completing words. So this would be the lesson segment in this foundational skills part here. That's how you would look at that and read that part. Also in your lesson overview, something that's really important to note, wanted to highlight the notas culturales. You know, for example, as you're reading, I wanted to, this is a really neat example that I can totally relate to. And what this nota cultural is that in many different parts of Latin American countries, there are words that one country may use in a very different way. Like, for example, here, Las medias, que son una prenda de vestir universal, también son llamadas en español calcetines y calcetas. So calcetines or medias, for example, medias, which means socks, can be said in many different ways in different parts of Latin American countries. And for example, I am from Panama, and we use the word medias, but there are other parts of other Latin American countries that use words like calcetines y calcetas. So that there's a really cool nota cultural that is embedded here. I mean, it's a really great teacher resource. Also, there's a conexión bilingüe, which gives you some information here in Spanish and in English and how those connections can be made. Those are also supports embedded in your lessons. And there's sidebar supports to challenge and give support, and scaffold for Spanish learners. So this is a great resource too for you as a teacher as you are previewing lessons, and gives you some really great information on how to scaffold and support your students in your classroom. Remember that I talked about pausing notes. So your pausing notes are going to be after the last lesson in the teacher guide. And the pausing notes section includes pausing points, which are days and where you have opportunities that you give, that teachers give students for targeted enrichment and or remediation instruction to solidify those skills that have been taught within the unit. So the pausing point section in the teacher guide, it offers a variety. If you look here, there's a variety of activities that you can pull from to fill those pausing day points for each unit. Again, for enrichment and or remediation instruction. And then finally, teacher resources section, which is located towards the end of your teacher's guide. Recursos para el maestro. So in the teacher's resources section, what you're going to find is resources to help you teach the unit. It includes answer keys, unit activity book pages, games, assorted forms and documents to monitor and track students' progress, and more. So this teacher resources section, Recursos para el Maestro, you will find towards the end of the teacher guide, and gives some really, really valuable information as well. Great resource for that you have at your disposal. Also want to make sure that we highlight the decodable readers, los libros decodificables for K-2. Want to make sure that you know that they are authentic to Spanish, have engaging illustrations and storylines, decode the sounds of focus, also include representation of many Spanish-speaking cultures, in addition to diverse cast of characters and settings. And they're authentic Spanish texts. There's no translations and no adaptations. Again, remembering these are original texts that includes authors from various Latin American countries, such as Puerto Rico, Mexico, España, Peru, and other South American countries. So authentic Spanish texts, those decodable readers are. Yes. So now in this time together, what we're going to do is look at the teacher's resource site. For those of you who have access and have credentials, feel free to actually follow along with me. But for those of you who don't, I want to make sure that you have some idea of where these resources are and where they can be found. When you are in the teacher resources site, which I am now because I am demonstrating live here, the Elementary Literacy Program Amplify.com site here. I am using grade 1 as an example, and you do have, for those of you who are familiar with the site, you have 3 tabs here: your intro, which is where we are, daily instruction and program resources. Where can you find the resources that you need for Habilidades y Destrezas? We're going to go to the daily instruction tab. So I'm going to click on this tab and just give you an overview of where your information is. So as you can tell, there is an English and a Spanish little toggle button. So if I've already have mine set to Spanish. And so what you will find is K1-2, you have Unidades 1 and 2 already on the teacher website. I do want to give the kindergarten folks some good news that just as of May 30th, Kinder has Unit 3 also here on the site, and we will be introducing Unit 3s for a 1 and 2 on a rolling basis. Those are coming up soon. So again, in daily instruction, instrucción diaria, comienza a planificar el día. And so I've already toggled to Spanish, and I want to just give you some information here of what this looks like. So I am actually going to click on, this is Unidad Una, your first unit. Let's click on Unidad Una and see as you click what information will be right at your fingertips here. So what you will have, Habilidades y Destrezas, Unidad Una, Unit 1, here are your materiales. Guía del Maestro, which is your teacher's guide. It is, you can download that. Cuaderno de Actividades, which is your student activity book that can be downloaded. Your digital components, your componentes digitales. There's some additional digital components here that you can download to project. Libro de lectura, your student reader. And you also have in grade 1, unique to grade 1 and kinder, you have Libro Grande, which is your big books. I also want to note that you hit this back button. I also want to note that you have some additional materials, your materiales complementarios, your supplementary materials here, very unique to K2. You'll have tarjetas de imágenes, which is your image cards. You have 2 of those because they're divided into sections. So this is part 1 of 4, part 2 of 4, and as we get 3 of 4 and 4 of 4, those will be put here. You also have tarjetas grandes de sílabas, big syllable cards. And you'll also have tarjetas grandes de letras, which are your letter cards. So that's included here. And then you also have your documents, your planning documents also here. Your guía de clases, guía de usuario, which is your program guide, and scope and sequences, and other additional information. Carta de bienvenida, which is, a letter that you can send to parents. So you have additional documents for planning here. So please make sure that you also check out your materiales complementarios here as well, because that gives you the other resources that are also part of your curriculum. So I just wanted to give you that overview live of what you can find in your teacher's resource. And if you ever, obviously if we want to go to a different grade, this is how it would look. You would go to grade K, load that, make sure that you toggle to the correct language, which would be Español. And again, kinder folks, Habilidades y Destrezas. Your unit 3 is already in the actual teacher's resource site. So I hope that was useful and beneficial as we give you some additional information. For those of you who have credentials to log in, feel free to peruse through that. And those who did not, now you have an idea of where those materials can be found. But want to make sure that if you need any platform support for those of you who have credentials, please make sure that you email technical support help@amplify.com. Again, if there's any Amplify support that you need as it relates to the platform, please make sure that you email technical support help@amplify.com. All right, moving right along. Now let's look at an actual unit introduction. So that was a really good overview. So we've gone through our program design, our materials, looked at our teachers resources site. Now let's look at and kind of go a little deeper in looking at a unit introduction. Again, for the purposes of this session, we're just going to explore a unit introduction and its components. So the introduction includes a wealth of information, as I've mentioned before. So the last paragraph, though, I want to make sure that you know that last paragraph of that unit introduction discusses all the various parts of the introduction. And so we really recommend that you read the full unit introduction and the teacher guide when you're teaching in your classroom. So this is here, the last paragraph, and again, gives you the various parts of that specific introduction. So what I want you to be thinking of, two questions that I want you to ponder as I go through this unit introduction piece section. What is included in the unit introduction for Unit 1? So be thinking of what's included. And also, what are some teaching tips and pedagogy discussed in the introduction? So if you want to jot down some responses to these two questions as I go through this, you're more than welcome to do that. I know some of you are taking really, really good notes there. So let's take a look at what is included in the unit introduction. As you read through the last paragraph there, look what's included. Plethora of information. What are the components of the program, right? As I went through and modeled live for you, the big books, the syllable cards, the image cards, etc. Those, it actually breaks down what those are. Also included is what's called Calendario de la Unidad, which is just a unit calendar and looks at all of those and looks at each lesson and looks at those, gives you a really nice overview of what the calendar looks like for that unit. And this is just an example of Unit 1. What you also get is Estructura de las Unidades y las Lecciones, the various structure. You know, you're looking at those objectives, looking at the formative assessments, the lesson at a glance. So this section here gives you a structure of those units and lessons as we talked about prior. What you also have is Evaluación en la Unidad Una. So for example, it has the assessments that will be included in this unit. You will also have, and so it's broken down here, you know, verificar la comprensión, where you're going to be verifying that comprehension. So it breaks down in each section and what lesson those assessments are going to happen. This is so great to have at your fingertips. An additional important piece is your mapa de destrezas, your skills map is included here. So it looks at kindergarten, what's going on in various of those units, and how you can look at grades 1 are going to be reviewed. For grade 1, units 8 and 9 are going to be reviewed, and units 1 and 2 when they get to grade 1, and then you will see for second grade, unit 7 is going to be reviewed when they review 1 and 2 in grade 2. So this gives you a really nice skills map. And then finally, you will also have your scope and sequence for your unit. And here's an example of a scope and sequence specifically for Unit 1. This is an example of first grade. So lots of information in that introduction. That's why we ask that you read it in its entirety. It gives you lots of information to be ready to plan and be ready to teach. Remember how I asked what are some different teaching tips and pedagogy? That's also included here. So let's take a look at what teaching tips and pedagogy. Some people say pedagogy. So what's included? What's included here is the science of reading research, la ciencia de lectura. You also have basic ideas that conform to the skills program, las ideas básicas que conforman este programa de habilidades y destrezas. And what you also have, which I found super helpful and useful, erroneous concepts about reading and writing, right? Dos conceptos erróneos sobre la lectura y escritura. So these are really important sections to read and some really great teaching tips and pedagogy that you have there. So now that we've gone over this, now you'll be able to identify what is in a unit. Now let's move into looking at a lesson and explore its contents. You should be experts at this because we have been reviewing lesson components and lesson segments throughout the session. So you should be experts in this area by now. So let's explore a lesson. I'm going to review lesson 2, unit 1 for grade 1. So as we look at this section here, and looking at the enfoque principal de la lesson, which is the primary focus of this lesson as it's broken down with the foundational skills. And then you have writing down here. And it also gives you a section of evaluación formativa, which is your formative assessments piece. And let's see how this is broken down in your lesson at a glance, which also gives you that useful information. So now, questions that I want you to be thinking of as we go through exploring a lesson. 2 things for those of you who are taking really great notes, right? What are the lesson components in this? I'm going to show you lesson 1, lesson 2, unit 1 for grade 1. What are the lesson components in lesson 1? Lesson 2, should I say? And then how are the design principles reflected in the lesson segments? So knowing here, as it even states, repaso means review. This is going to be a review lesson. So lesson 2 tells you right here, this is lección 2, lesson 2. So this page is going to illustrate the main focus, which is here, main focus of the lesson and the components of that lesson, as I mentioned to you previously. So it gives you destrezas fundamentales, which are your foundational skills. And it also gives you escritura, which is writing. And so these are known as your lesson components. And now as we move to looking at our lesson at a glance, once again, that's right. Some of you are like, oh, I know what those are already. Those lesson components are my foundational skills and my writing. And then what are those lesson segments? See if you know those. You know them, don't you? Here in blue, we're going to look at our lesson segments, which are our smaller pieces, right? So here we're looking at in our foundational skills, right? We're going to be looking at some warm-up activities, combining and segmenting some syllables, looking at our image cards, also in looking at some review of spelling here. And then in our writing piece, in our writing component section, what they'll be doing is looking at phrases and sentences. You knew that already, right? Everyone got this right because we've been talking about our components and segments throughout this session. So give yourselves a hand because I know you got all of this. You understand this completely. So now let's pause. Let's take a minute. And now as we are going to segue to looking at how do we get all of this? I'm ready. This is an exciting curriculum. I am ready to get this information in the hands of teachers. Let's look at our print materials and how we order print materials. Again, remember digital free, but if print materials, TEA wants to make a special note that CRIMSI 2022-2023 participants and T-Class Award recipients will follow ordering protocols of those initiatives. So how do you order? You've been asking yourself this since I showed you that first slide, right? I'm like, how do I get all of this? So what you want to make sure that you do is you connect with your Amplify account executive to order materials. If you don't know who that is, you can reach out to Texas at amplify.com. Again, reaching out to your account, your Amplify account executive to order those materials. And if you don't know who that is, you can reach out to Texas at amplify.com. What's the timeline, you say? So know that the first 2 units will be received in mid-July. As you know, those units are already digitally in the teacher resource site. And the rest will arrive on a rolling basis. More details are to come on the timelines really, really soon. So know that this again, since it's being built from the ground up, these specific units will be printed and sent on they'll arrive on a rolling basis. You will have everything you need prior to starting your school year. So again, new program, and your materials will be received on a rolling basis over the year. But do not fret, as you will have what you need prior to the beginning of the school year. So let's reflect and close out. As we have gone through the program design, we actually looked at the materials you will have, really plethora of information, lots of resource materials for you. We went through a specific unit introduction for Unit 1 specifically, looked at a lesson. How would you describe the Amplified Texas Habilidades and Destrezas? How would you describe that in one word? So hopefully, now that we're wrapping up, our objectives again, let's take a look to see if we were able to meet those. Feel like you're able to describe the Amplified Texas Habilidades y Destrezas Skills Strand Program design principles. If you needed to describe that to someone, you would be able to at the end of the session. Did we examine those materials for Amplified Texas Habilidades and Destrezas on the teacher resource site? We sure did. Check. And for those of you who have accounts, again, feel free to go through that and explore later on a little bit more in depth if you'd like. And then able to identify some Amplified Texas Habilidades y Destrezas unit and lesson. I feel that you are going to be experts in this area as we've gone through our time together today, looking at those lesson components and lesson segments. I feel like we were able to meet all three of those objectives. So I want to give you a round of applause there for that. As we close, stay connected. We have a science of reading, the community here. And then we also have listen to that science of reading, that podcast. Really good. What is coming up? Upcoming webinar series. Foundations of the curriculum. That's a session that's going to be coming up. So we're going to dive deep into what the foundation of that curriculum is. Unit internalization, looking at a unit and internalizing that unit is another upcoming webinar series. And then finally, the lesson internalization webinar will close the webinar series out. So dates and times to be announced. So we have some upcoming webinars coming up as well. Thank you. Thank you so much for participating in this session today. I hope that you feel prepared to start your journey with Amplify Texas Habilidades y Destrezas curriculum. So awesome to be with you, and hope that you found this session to be informative and gives you lots of information in order to be able to turn this around in your classrooms. So some final thoughts. Remember that todo experto fue alguna vez principiante, which in essence means the expert in anything was once a beginner. So I want to thank you for your time. Have a great summer, everyone.